Hello, everybody. Today we will start the journey of learning about fish. Now, fish um, are a very large group of animals. They make up close to 50% of all chordates. And so I've decided to split the fish information up into two different sections. We're going to start learning about the jawless fish and the cartilaginous fish in this video, and then in the next video, we'll learn about the bony fish. Um, but just to start with some cool and interesting facts, if you think about it, fish are amazing. Fish have a little known system called a lateral line system. A lateral line system goes along the lateral part of the body, so the outside, and it can detect changes in water current, so they can detect movement around them, sometimes from even as far as miles away. Fish live in a medium that is 800 times more dense than air, meaning their muscles have to be efficient in different ways to cut through the water. And there is 1/20th the amount of oxygen dissolved in water compared to air. So their gills have to be very, very efficient at extracting that oxygen from the water. Some history about fish. The oldest fish fossils date back to about 550 million years ago. The earliest fish descended from a free-swimming protochordate, something we learned about last unit. And some divisions we're going to talk about today. The agnathan are the jawless fish, which show up about 535 million years ago in the fossil record, and that includes things like hagfish and lamprey. And then gnathostomes are the jawed fish, which are broken up into the chondrochythes and osteocythes fish. Here's just a few examples, right? Here's the hagfish, which really only has a caudal fin, which is the outside back fin. You can see the analogous caudal fin over here. And it doesn't have jaws, but it does have a head. And then here is a shark. And just a little bit about bony fish. I know I said we're just going to go into our last fish video, but just a very small amount here. The bony fish are split up into two distinct groups. You have the ray fin fish, like we see here, which have bony fins, and then the lobe fin fish, which fins look like this. Ray fin fish are more common. There are not a lot of lobe fin fish. And lobe fin fish are thought to be the ancestor of modern tetrapods because their limbs, in here the bones, resemble preliminary hand bones that you might see in other tetrapods. Some basic characteristics that almost all fish share. There are close to 25,000 different living species. They are all aquatic vertebrates, and most fish have paired fins, protective scales, and gills. We talked a little bit about the evolution of jaws in our last unit, how it basically allows for the formation of muscles and teeth, which allow for a wider variety of food to be eaten. But they also can defend themselves by biting, think sharks. But paired fins were also an important development in terms of evolutionary history, because basically a paired fin in the water gives the body more control and balance, and a tail fin gives it a greater thrust when swimming. Compare that to something we talked about earlier in the year, like cephalopods, which have to crawl along the bottom of the floor of the oceans. But when they are swimming, they kind of just jet away, but there's not much control, and they can't sustain that for long periods of time. But with the evolution of things like fins, there's more control and a greater thrust for longer swimming distances. Some basic features of the fish anatomy. This is the fish digestive. This is the fish digestive tract. It has a mouth, esophagus, stomach, liver, intestine, pancreas, and anus. Very similar to all of the same parts you have. Respiration in fish is done through gills. Water is basically pulled through the mouth. It runs over the gills, and oxygen is removed from the water that runs over the gills by diffusion. And then oxygen would then be pumped to the heart where it can flow to the rest of the body. And we can see how that would work here. Fish have a closed circulatory system, one of the few animals we've talked about this year with a closed circulatory system. And they have a heart that's split up into two chambers, an atrium and a ventricle. The atrium receives oxygen-deprived blood, and the ventricle pumps that blood to the gills or lungs if we're talking about a lungfish. And then the blood flows from the heart to the gills, and then from the gills to the body, and then back to the heart. Right, so that's how it goes. So if we start at the heart, pumps it to the gills pumps it to the body, and the body pumps the blood back to the heart. Very simple two-chambered heart here. And we can see generally how that works in this picture, right? The picture depicts it as oxygenated blood here on the top in red, deoxygenated at the bottom. Here's the heart. So the heart, every blood flow returns back to the heart here. And then the blood will get pumped to the gills where it gets oxygenated, gets spread through the body, and then comes back to the heart. There are a couple exceptions. This is called a crocodile icefish. It is the only vertebrate animal that doesn't have a form of hemoglobin. And hemoglobin, if you didn't know, is the protein found in red blood cells that holds oxygen. They live in ice-cold water, very, very deep down in the oceans. And ice-cold water has higher amounts of dissolved oxygen. And so they don't actually need that molecule hemoglobin to spread oxygen all over their body. They can just diffuse it through their skin. Excretion is removed by kidneys. Kidneys remove the waste, higher salt concentration, too much water, different solutes, things like that, filtered out by the kidneys. Response system, we're talking like nervous system stuff here. Fishes have really well developed nervous systems with a brain containing some common anatomical parts that are very similar to your brain, right? In your brain, you have a cerebrum, a cerebellum, an optic lobe, a medulla oblongata, etc. They're just bigger at different areas, especially in the frontal lobe. You can see how simple it is, but also complex in terms of the animal we've been talking about so far this year. This is the lateral line system, and you can actually see it in the scales here, and how it goes along the outside of their body. This is what detects movement in and around the water currents surrounding fish. And it can be any fish, from a cartilaginous fish to a bony fish, and it's even still present in some amphibians. Keeping afloat is an important thing for fish, and there are two main strategies. Bony fish have an internal organ called a swim bladder. The swim bladder basically fills with air, and that air can be pulled out of the circulatory system. And it can fill with air or deflate depending on where they want to be in the water. So they can control how buoyant they are like that. Compare that to a shark or all of the cartilaginous fish, which rely on a very large and oily liver. And oil is less dense than water. It floats on the top of water. So by having this large oily liver, they can stay a little bit more afloat than if they didn't have that. Reproduction method in fish, we basically see all types, internal or external, and all three types of birthing method. Again, fish being such a large group, it's hard to put it into just one category. So let's start talking about some specific examples of fish. So let's start with the agnatha fish. The agnatha fish are living jawless fish. Those are things like hagfish and lamprey. Both lack jaws, internal ossification, which means hard bones, scales, or paired fins. Both groups share a pore-like gill opening and an eel-like body shape. This is what a lamprey's mouth part looks like. There's no defined jaw, but it does have a mouth, right, with these little scraping teeth that honestly look like a nightmare. Um, if any of you watched this show on FX called The Strain, they had it was about like a vampire attack, like taking over a town. And In this show, the vampires were kind of special. They didn't just like suck blood with their two canine teeth. What they did instead is they used a mouth part that came out of their mouth that looked exactly like a lamprey and a lamprey mouth, like you see here. It's kind of interesting if you ever go watch the show. So a little bit about lampreys. Lampreys are typically filter feeders as larvae, but parasitic as adults. Um, they usually attach themselves to fish, whales, dolphins, any kind of large aquatic animal, and just scrape away at the skin with these small teeth-like structure. And then once they get past the skin, they basically suck up all the tissues and the body fluids of its host. And then once they've fed enough or there's no more nutrients, they just attach and look for a new host. And this is what the life cycle looks like here. If you haven't done so already, go and watch one of those lamprey videos. They're pretty interesting, especially to see it actually feed and move in person. So again, here's the larvae. So they reproduce in streams. Larvae are released. They filter feed until they get big enough, and then they go through a metamorphosis where they grow the mouth parts needed to go through this parasitic life stage. And then they live in lakes, parasitizing all of these different large animals that live in there. And you can see just a couple here attached to this other fish. Another example here, this is a pretty large lamprey. You can also see here the gill holes. They're not traditional gill slits like you would see in other fish. Hagfish are the other main animal we're going to talk about in this category. Hagfish are almost entirely marine, so live in saltwater, and most are scavengers. What they do is they enter the body of dead or dying animals through some kind of orifice, whether it's the mouth and anus or any kind of hole in the animal. And then they dig inside of it using these keratinized plates on its tongue. It's nearly blind. It locates its food with a very good sense of smell and touch. So once it locates its food, it digs into the body of its prey and just starts to eat it until all the rest of it's gone. Hagfish also have this specialized gland along the side of their body that secretes a protein, and that protein becomes extremely slimy when it comes in contact with seawater, and it's the hagfish's main method of defense. You can see the keratinized plates that help it dig through here, and here are some slime glands on the outside of its body. And so what happens is somebody or something tries to come and grab it or eat it, a hagfish will release a bunch of slime. And the slime can actually choke the animal that's trying to eat it. And the hagfish just wiggles away. If you haven't watched that video yet that I put online, please go watch it. It's really interesting. Hagfish. So those are our agnathofish. Let's jump into class Chondrochythes. Chondrochythes are sharks, skates, rays, and sawfish, and there are about 970 different species. Most are marine. There's no bone, mineralized teeth, or scales, but they do have other means of protection. You can just see a couple examples here. This is a ray, and this is a skate. You can generally tell rays' tails are longer. They have a stinger, which is also called a spine, while skates don't. Their bodies are a little bit more long and slender, while a skates are more broad and a little fatter. And then this animal over here is called a sawfish. So cool fact, many sharks have thousands of teeth arranged in several rows. And you can actually see the rows here, 1, 2, 3 rows here. And new teeth develop internally, and it pushes old teeth external. And so they're constantly growing new teeth and replacing all of their teeth. And so as they grow more teeth, the older ones push out, and they can constantly be making sharp teeth here. And like I said earlier, sharks don't have a swim bladder. Instead, they rely on their liver, which produces an oil, which is less dense than water. It helps to keep them afloat. But if they stop swimming for too long, they would potentially have trouble with breathing and staying afloat. And so generally, sharks have to swim for most of their lives. A couple different examples of sharks and where you might find them. Basking and whale sharks are the largest sharks you can find in the ocean. Generally, they're deeper out in the ocean, and they feed on smaller fish, plankton, things like that. If we're talking like hammerhead sharks, angel sharks, nurse sharks, bull sharks, those are generally the sharks found closest to the shore. And then the great white sharks are a little bit further out in the ocean. But if you look at their size, they are the biggest of like carnivore sharks here that hunt big game. I like this video here. I did put it online, but you can see a whale shark basically vacuuming in a bunch of little fish. Doesn't have very sharp teeth. Instead, it just tries to suck in these large amounts of fish. These up here are called placoid scales. Placoid scales are basically non-traditional scales found on sharks and rays. Um, they're designed to increase the they're designed to increase a shark's speed through the water, right? They allow for water currents to move very fast over this area. Um, if you've ever felt a shark, if we ever get to come back in person, I'll let you guys feel eventually shark skin, and if you rub it the opposite direction of these placoid scales, it almost feels like sandpaper. And if you're a swimmer, most swimsuits and swim gear has been designed after the placoid scales found on sharks and skates and rays. You can also see a couple different things here. Here's the lateral line system going along the outside of the shark's body. The other structure you need to know about is called the ampullae of Lorenzini. The ampullae of Lorenzini are found in the shark's nostril region. If you look, here's a pore with a jelly-filled canal leading up to the ampullae of Lorenzini, which lead to nerves. These things can detect bioelectric fields, which means they can detect living things around them and the electricity that living things basically expel from their bodies. So if there's something moving within 100 or 1,000 feet of it, it could detect its bioelectric field. Go through and make sure you watch those shark videos that I put on there. They're all pretty cool. Here's an example of a cookie cutter shark, the smallest shark species. It goes and preys on bigger things, and it basically attaches to them, takes small little bites out of them. They are the smallest and really only parasitic sharks out there. Great white sharks, a couple little facts here. They can live up to 25 years, grow up to about 20 feet in length. Sometimes you'll see them doing this thing called sky hopping, where they stick their head out of the water to see their prey that's on the surface. Great white sharks can go about 3 months without food, but they need to eat on average about 10,000 pounds of food a year. In general, great white sharks are not a danger to humans, and that's the case for almost all sharks. The issue is in areas where sharks and humans mix where they're not necessarily supposed to. Yes, there are shark attacks sometimes, but sharks on the whole are less dangerous than driving in your car every day. Less people die from shark attacks than they do getting run over by a bus a year. That's because to sharks, humans don't taste the greatest. Sharks' favorite food is a seal. A seal's chopped full of fat and really heavy, where a shark, if it gets a hold of a seal, basically doesn't need to eat for another month. So oftentimes a lot of human attacks that were done by the sharks, people just lose limbs, which not great necessarily, but better than dying. And that's basically because the shark comes up and like tastes you, right? They come and take a bite. They realize, oh, hey, this isn't a seal. This doesn't taste very good. I'm just gonna swim away. And that's true for most shark attacks. This is a bull shark. It is the only shark that can be found in both salt and freshwater. They are mostly coastal. They give birth to somewhere between 4 and 10 pups who immediately leave the mom. At 6 years old, they are adults and they grow up to about 13 feet long. If you've ever seen Jaws, heard the story about Jaws, part of Jaws takes place in fresh water up a river. That's why they believe that the sharks most likely found in the real stories that led to the book and the movie Jaws are most likely a bull shark instead of a great white shark because it was a freshwater ecosystem. And then just to finish our cartilaginous fish discussion, we're going to talk about skates, rays, and sawfish. So the largest rays eat floating plankton, and that's generally true all in nature, right? The larger animals eat plankton and small fish and bacteria and things like that. There are some electric rays and skates which produce a high amperage current from an electric organ in their body and can shock their prey. Most skates and rays feed on mollusks, crustaceans, and small fish. Here is a ray, here is a skate over here. We can see the electric organs in their body, left and right electric organ here. This is controlled by their cerebellum, which is part of their brainstem. Here we can see the distinction between the skate and the ray in terms of anatomy. Again, spine on the tail, no spine, longer tail. These ones are generally skinnier and wider than what you might see as a skate. And this is what the underneath looks like here are nares, which are similar to nostrils, their mouth, and gill slits here. We've all probably heard the story about how Steve Irwin died. If you don't know who Steve Irwin is, he was the crocodile hunter. Very famous when I was a kid for basically being an animal explorer. If you're ever looking for a YouTube deep dive, go ahead and look up him. It's a pretty fun watch. But he tragically died at a relatively young age from a stingray sting. And what happened is he got stung, and these things detach. This is the barb from a stingray, and we can see how it comes out of the tail here. All these pictures here. And one of the most dangerous things about stingrays isn't necessarily how big or sharp the stings are, it's that they're barbed and serrated. Basically, think of them as large, double-sided kitchen knives. And so if you get stung in a vital area and take it out, not only does it hurt going in, but it tears the flesh coming out. And so Steve Irwin's biggest issue, and the reason why he died, and honestly, it's a reason he should have known and he should have kept it in there, but he got stung and tried to pull out the spine, and he did. And when he did that, it tore away tissue, causing large amounts of bleeding, and he eventually bled out and died before he reached the hospital. So if you ever are stung by the spine of a stingray, keep it in there and make your way to a hospital. And then there are some really good ray videos that I put in your homework for Wednesday. So please go and check them out. Last little bit is about reproduction, and then I'll show you a sawfish and we'll be done here. So chondrochythes have internal fertilization and all three birthing methods. One of the more interesting examples of a birthing method is this oviparous birthing type, what we see here, known as a mermaid's purse. A mermaid's purse is what happens when a shark releases their eggs, or generally most members of chondrochythes actually. And so they release their eggs, but they also release like an encasing surrounding the egg, and sometimes they'll suspend these encasings in protected areas. And it looks like a basically little protective bag that surrounds the growing embryo. and so it's called a mermaid's purse. Very, very cool and interesting. That's all I got for you today. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you have a good rest of your day.